Next session is entitled as Fiscal Crisis in Advanced Economies. So let me introduce the panelists. Starting with the right side, Mr. Jasper Cole, Managing Director and Head of Japanese Equity Research, JP Morgan Securities Japan. And then Mr. Thierry Pote, Operating Partner, JC Flowers and Company LC. And Mr. Keiichiro Asano, Member of the House of Representatives. And the moderator is Mr. Hiromichi Mizuno, Partner at Coller Capital.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming. I know this is not the only choice for you this afternoon, and thank you for choosing our panel. And before we begin, I would just like to say how happy I am to take a part in this very first G1 Global Summit, and I'm happy to take active role as a moderating this panel with distinguished panelists and with respected audience. Actually, when I left Japan 2 days ago, I thought this panel topic is going to be a bit out of fashion with the recently agreed bailout plan. But when I arrived in Narita, I saw another news, which now they might be going for referendum. So unfortunately, this panel topic regained the momentum. And so as you know, the fiscal crisis in advanced economy is such a broad topic. So today, we are going to approach this topic from 3 perspectives. First of all, what's now happening in Europe, and how and if and how the euro would solve this problem. And then, whether this crisis will be contained within the Eurozone or will result in a global financial crisis phase 2. And finally, but not least, as this G1 Global Summit is happening in Tokyo, and we have Keiichiro representing the Japanese, the politicians. So I thought we are trying to discuss at the end what Japan should do to support the Eurozone or potentially helping the global economy while managing our own fiscal problems. So I really don't think this panel requires any introduction. So we should just we were just going to jump onto the discussion of today's topic. As I said, first of all, we just wanted to to discuss briefly what's happening in Euro, so that to help you to understand just beyond what has been reported in the Japanese press. Actually, I was looking at the Japanese newspaper this morning, but the euro crisis hasn't been discussed too much in detail. So I thought I had a feeling that the Japanese media feels like it's happening somewhere very far at the corner of the world, but it's not really the situation, I think. So I just want to ask Thierry to kick off the discussion of what's going on in the Eurozone at the moment.
Thanks very much. So we have a vast topic. I start by saying that you have in front of you here, you have a German and a Frenchman. I have a French passport as well as an American passport. But in addition, which I think is helpful to the discussion, you have a Frenchman and a German who've lived outside of their respective home countries for a long time, and therefore I think can look at some of the issues with some perspective. I'm going to try to very briefly, in just a few minutes, because we also agreed among ourselves that we'd like to have a lot of discussion and have your views and your, not just questions, but also ideas. So I'll try to very quickly summarize how we got to where we are and what I think the alternatives are. Think about the human body. You have a toe infection. You should go to the doctor and have it treated. And if you do that quickly, then you should be safe. Well, Greece is the toe infection. But unfortunately, the strategy of the European governmental leadership has been to procrastinate, or as they say, kick the can down the road. Is that a can of German beer? Is that a can of Irish beer? We don't know. But it's also fundamentally to muddle through. And as a result, what was just a toe infection, because if you put it in the grand scheme of things, the total debt of Greece right now is about 350 billion euros. It's not the end of the world. But because we have procrastinated so much, because of this strategy of muddle through, and put it in context, in the last 21 months, We have had 14 definitive emergency meetings of the European Union leaders, and we still don't have a solution. As a result, now the entire body is infected. We have a problem of sovereign debt. We have a problem of the banking system. We have a problem of these economies in Europe which are not growing, which is a problem for Japan and for China and for the United States. We have now created the potential for a global conflagration. Now, what are the 4 different solutions? I'm going to schematize here. What are the 4 different solutions that have been debated and that have been attempted to be discussed as potential solutions? And why have none of them really been selected? The first one is what I would call the Irish solution, because if there's one country in Europe that has taken the medicine, it is the Irish. They wiped out their own banking system, largely because of excess speculative lending, and they decided consciously to indebt themselves more to bail out their banks. That's what they did. They doubled their debt by doing that. And the Irish solution is we accept a lower standard of living. We cut the salaries of civil servants, we raise our taxes, we have to make more sacrifices. In the case of the Irish, since they have a history of it, if you don't like that, you leave, you go overseas. That's the Irish solution. It's pretty tough, all right? It's pretty tough. And it takes time, and it's harsh. The second is what I would describe as the default solution. So this is, you know, basically, okay, you can't pay, I can't pay, I'm not going to pay, I default. This is not acceptable because, in effect, what one has to understand about Europe is that the northern countries, particularly the banks of Germany and France, finance the southern countries, Italy, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain. So this is a very nasty and difficult solution. And what has been attempted is what we couldn't really do in Japan when we had the crisis, which is use the yield curve, make profits in the banks, and eventually you'll be able to cover those losses. But of course, events have moved ahead in advance of what the Europeans have been able to deal with. The third is European fiscal integration, because, you know, the fundamental mistake, some of my French friends call this just a design flaw. I call it, if you're in the middle of the bridge and there's a design flaw, you fall through and you die, all right, is that we have agreement on a monetary union, we don't have fiscal union, and we don't have political union. And if anybody doesn't want to believe that this creates the elements of a crisis, then all you have to do is look at what happened yesterday when the Greeks raised their hand and say, by the way, we'd like to renegotiate the terms, and we believe in democracy, so we're going to ask our people what they want to do. As a result, we have a mess. Moreover, in the European fiscal integration solution, what certain people realize, particularly the French, is that the Germans are in charge because of the golden rule. They have the gold, they set the rules. Therefore, if we have European fiscal integration, it is going to be the German way. So the fourth way is debasing the euro. Okay, what do? The European Central Bank, we do have a central bank. It basically monetizes the debt, and we have inflation, the euro goes down, everybody's happy. Except the Germans required something called Article 37. That means the Article 37 does not allow the ECB, in effect, to sterilize the debt. And moreover, the Germans have 2 key conditions that we should never forget as we continue in this crisis. Number 1, no inflation. They had Weimar. The results in the 1930s after that weren't too good. They don't want to go back there. Inflation is unacceptable to Germans. And secondly is the currency must remain strong. Debasement of the currency is also not acceptable to Germans. The French have less religion on this, but the Germans are very strong on this. So those are the 4 alternatives, and none of them have been picked. That's why we've talked about EFSF. That's why we've talked about bank recapitalization. With whose money? We don't know, but let's have it. That's why we talk about stress tests, one of my favorite subjects. So Dexia Bank, a Belgian bank that probably nobody had heard of until they finally had to be nationalized. Just to put it in context, stress test of Dexia Bank. When they did the stress test in July, it was in the top 12 of the best banks. It was nationalized 3 weeks ago. Why is that? Well, because in the stress test, all sovereign debt is at par. So no stress there, right? I mean, except for your Greek debt, which is at a 21% discount when it trades at a 55% discount. This is not a stress test. It doesn't work. So we can't have any of those four solutions, but the crisis continues and deepens. And all of the attempts to put together a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and a little bit of bailout, and a little bit of recapitalization, and a little bit of a fund, which we're not quite sure how it works, doesn't work. So we're now faced, I think, with the ultimate crisis, which is the Greeks declaring that we're not just going to take this, and we're also going to have a vote. And I think this creates a very fundamental crisis, and it may put us, we can talk about it later, on the precipice of a Lehman event. So what are the three remaining solutions in terms of this? First, the debt holders have to take losses. Bear in mind, up until now, the idea has been, we'll ask some debt holders to take losses, but not all debt holders to take losses. Let's put it in context. You take that 350 billion euros of Greek debt. 150 billion of it is in the hands of the ECB and the so-called Troika, official institutions. That doesn't get any haircut. It's all the other debt that gets the haircut. So when the Greeks talk about when you talk about a 50% haircut, it's not on 350. It's 50% on the 200. Very important distinction. Very big problem. Now, I think that ultimately we have to consider that all of the debt holders are going to have to take some kind of serious haircut. The second solution is fiscal union. All right, we're going to have to go for it, and we're all going to have to be put in the same boat. But fiscal union means political union, means we're all going to be Germans. And then the third solution is, I think we're now at the point where the only remaining third solution is debt monetization and inflation. But as I've talked about before, that is an unacceptable result. And of course, the fourth one, which is the one I think runs the risk of creating a Lehman moment, is the Greeks leaving the euro. And what is the implication of the Greeks leaving the euro? What it means is that the day that it happens, and it can happen, it can be done, their entire banking system will go under. No one is going to touch them. They're going to become, untouchable. And then what is not clear, I don't think what is fully understood, but is what we should worry about, is the chain reaction of effects thereafter. I could give you a scenario. The Greeks vote against the plan for austerity, against the European Union plan. As a result, they leave the euro. Their banking system goes under. One of their biggest banks is owned by Société Générale. Société Générale, one of the biggest banks in France, goes under because nobody wants to lend to them now because they're considered to be untouchable. Then France, of course, has to step in and nationalize them. And maybe other French banks are also having trouble. But then France loses its AAA rating. It becomes a AA. And not only does that mean that they're only AA when the Germans and the Luxembourgers are AAA, but also then your European fund doesn't work anymore because it won't be AAA anymore. And why should Japan and China invest in that fund? Then we have to start to have real trouble. Not to mention that a bank like that is, and I'm not making any particular, I'm giving you a hypothetical for those who might be tweeting. This is purely a hypothetical. I'm giving you a scenario. I'm not making any statements of fact. But then we have all the issues of all the derivatives that people have and how we start to unwind all of these things. It could be quite an incredible mess.
Thanks, Thierry. Jesper, I just, the theory covered a lot, but I just want to ask you that when I'm speaking, talking to my, my friend or colleagues in Europe, there seems to be very strong belief that given the history, Germany has a very, very strong incentive and motivation to keep the Eurozone together. And although they know they, at the end of the day, have to finance all the costs, so as Thierry mentioned, at the end of the day, it's going to be going towards the Germanization of Europe, and which will create a lot of a political conflict and etc. But, given your German blood, I mean, what do you think what's happening in Germany? Do you think that what my friend, that tells me that the German is not going to let the Greek leave is, has some reality in it?
I mean, we're just going to invade them. That would be the old solution. I mean, look, just remember where Europe came from. I mean, you've had basically since 1848, you had 3 generations of Germans and French wiping out their children. Massive wars 3 times. And the origin of the euro was the German and French elite getting together and saying, well, this is stupid, this is inhuman, let us build a system that makes war between Germany and France, that makes war in Europe impossible. And so we started out with the coal and steel union between Germany and France, and then it went on forward, right? I'll tell you a little anecdote, since I am German, and Terry has, told all the hard stuff. I'm from Düsseldorf. Düsseldorf in the 1920s, when Germany didn't pay its reparations, was invaded by the French, and we didn't really like the French. My father, who was born in 1921, was taught to hate the French. I was born 40 years later in 1961, and since the age of 2, since I was in kindergarten, I had annual or semi-annual exchanges with Jean-Luc. Unfortunately, there was a Jacqueline, and there were all these pretty French girls as well, but lots of exchange at the grassroots level. And quite frankly, when the wall came down in 1989, I didn't quite know what all the fuss was all about. My family has no relations in the East, right? But I thought, well, Wolfgang from Leipzig, I have less in common with him than with Jean-Luc, because Jean-Luc and I listen to the same music, we watch the same movies, we read the same books, while Wolfgang from Leipzig obviously was brought up in a completely different system there. So, huge success in terms of, getting the goal, right, of really integrating, at all levels, from the grassroots level all the way up to the high politics, right, the 2 major powers, that came through it, right? Then we had monetary union, and that really, at the end of the day, is the ultimate symbol. I mean, you give up the currency. Are you prepared to give up your yen? Yes. Okay, well, good, don't tweet that. Right, so now you've got a very, very serious problem. And, I would slightly disagree with Terry in the sense of that I actually don't think that there is a solution. There is not a simple solution. For example, let's look at the 4th one, which, people also use sometimes for Japan. Why doesn't Japan just weaken the yen? If you debase the currency, if the euro falls by 30, 40%, then everything is going to be fine. No, it won't be, because Greece doesn't export anything. All the Chinese in the world would have to be tourists, right, in Greece in order to do that. Sure, Germany would benefit tremendously, right, by a weaker euro, and that maybe would strengthen the German ability and willingness, right, to take a larger haircut for the Greek debt. But at the end of the day, the issue is a very simple one. The people of Greece will have to become, pick a number, between 30 and 50% poorer relative to where they are today. That is the hard fact that the Irish, as you rightly pointed out, have started to swallow here, right? In Germany itself, it's very interesting, right? And you do have to give a lot of credit to the German politicians. And as you know, I don't give a lot of credit to most politicians, right? Particularly Japanese and American ones. Of course, present company accepted. But it's quite interesting because, my favorite statistics at the moment is there's 6 cars burning every night in Berlin. Over the last 6 months, on average, 6 cars burning. And it is not cars burning because of some neo-Nazi who doesn't like the Turks, right? This is people setting lights to fire, setting cars on fire that are BMW or Porsche or Mercedes because, of somebody who's doing well, right? So the discontent, right, in German society is very strong. And the Germans do know that at the end of the day, yes, it will have to be the Germans who will have to pay for whatever is going to be happening here, right? And as you know, public opinion polls, this, that, or the other, basically somewhere between 70 and 80% of the German people do not want to pay for the Greeks. Already the cost of the various bailouts conducted so far is equivalent to about 3% of GDP. Unification, the cost of unification, comes to about 4.5% of GDP, right? The cost of the reparations under Versailles was about 5% of GDP when all is said and done. So already, you're quite high in terms of the burden that the Germans actually have taken on themselves. But despite the fact that populism in Germany, right, would want to throw Greece out, literally, right? Despite all of that, the German elite, Angela Merkel, the German finance minister, they adhere to the religion of putting Europe first, and they want to work towards a solution. Outlook, what's going to happen from here, I think is very simple, right? This will not go away. This is going to be, Terry mentioned there were 14 packages put together. I make a bet with you that over the next 12 months, you will get at least another 8 or 9 packages. There's not a magic button that you can press to make this work out, and the political dynamics is going to get much, much more intense. Why? Because the two big guys have elections. Next year, it is the French presidential election. I'm sure Mr. Sarkozy is very happy of whatever happened to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, right? But we shall see what will happen there, right? And then, once the French do get a new president, what will happen in 2013? We have the German election, right, coming up there. So this will continue to be a very, very big issue. So my message here is not a magic bullet. It's not available. Kicking down the can, or as a German, I would say pragmatism, right, is going to continue to be, but the political and the risk of one of the big powers, and it's not going to be the Germans, but one of the big powers, right, actually giving in to populism, right, I think, is going to be very, very high.
I think that to follow on just very quickly on that, in contrast to Germany, where the political leadership has very strong leadership and is prepared to stand against public opinion. In France, and this comes from a difficult history that started in 1789, when people go into the street and protest, French politicians give in. It's a totally different situation. And I think, so Jesper's absolutely right. The dynamic of what is going to happen in these individual countries, and particularly Germany and France, I don't see a risk that the German leadership will move. But the French leadership, it's now a very strong pattern of giving in. And then who knows where we go from there.
So both of you are saying is, before I just ask some question to Keiichiro, but both you are saying is, this package, whatever being discussed today at Kanu, is not going to provide the final solution. So at least until the German election in 2012, we just continue to see the new package, and delay the final, delay the accepting the pain, and during that period of time, the actual problem grow and grow.
Look, Europe is not North Korea. There isn't a guy who says, this is how we're going to do it, and shut up. Right. You've got Lithuania. I'm sorry, I am hard-pressed to find Lithuania on a map. Lithuania can say no to the treaty, right? The Finns, or the true Finns, apparently, as opposed to the false Finns, they can say no. This is a very complicated, agreement that has been worked out, right? Now, what's going to get interesting, right? And this is, I'm just going to move for 30 seconds somewhere else, because I think it's rather fitting that the summit is in Cannes, which tends to be the, it's for movie stars, right, rather than decision makers. But here's what will happen now. Until now, the European economies, the core European economies, Germany and France, have had very good tailwinds, right, from a weaker euro, from a global economy that was relatively strong, right? What is now going to happen, or what is likely to happen over the next 9 to 12 months, is core Europe is going to go into recession. German unemployment is going to start to increase. French unemployment is going to start to increase. So the pressures, right, on populism are going to become much, much more pronounced, I think.
Right. Sounds good. And I think this is quite insightful. And, Keiichiro, you feel free to add, anything to what we have discussed so far. But probably you can just bridge to the second topic, which at the moment, it seems like the fire is on the other side of the river, but would it be coming to Japan, or just going to be the fire will extend to the U.S. So how are you viewing?
Okay, well, as to your point, I guess the answer is yes. I mean, the impact of this euro crisis is far greater than the impact that we had from the earthquake. That is probably the truth. I mean, this will affect Japan more than the earthquake. The earthquake was about 4% of our GDP. Euro probably will be much heavier, unfortunately, than the Lehman shock. And also, I guess the truth is that, as was mentioned, because of the fact that these countries are all in democracy, this will take more time than recovering from the Lehman shock. In other words, there will be a crisis in Greece. However they deal with that, it might go, but then, unfortunately, people may look at Societe Generale or Portugal or some other country, and banks that are lending to those countries will be targeted by the market, which means that the Greek problem may go, but the market will look at some other countries, and at that time, the stock prices in Europe will go down, the stock prices in the United States probably will go down, and the stock price in Japan will go down. The crisis in Europe has caused our stock prices to go down even further than after the earthquake. So that's a symbol of how great this is. And so, although it has not been discussed in the political arena in Japan as much as in other countries, I think it should be discussed at least as much as how we should deal with the earthquake. The earthquake was a tragedy, but I think the solution is much simple than compared to the euro, because euro, we don't have any vote, unfortunately. My people cannot say anything towards the European Bank. However, it will affect us more. So that's the reality, and we have to come out a solution, so that our people can say, and so that I can say something towards Europe.
So, thank you. And for the last couple of months, I've been advocating that this situation at sometime in the future will be named GFC2, Global Financial Crisis Phase 2 or number 2. But at the moment, the U.S. seems to be sitting on the fence a little bit, and it hasn't been really kind of publicly treated as global crisis. Well, Jesper or Thierry, what do you think? Just what's going to be the impact on the global economy?
It obviously has a major impact on the global financial system. I think with that I would slightly disagree. I think global whatever the name you put through it, but it is and has been for the last 9 months on the top of the agenda here. Now the interesting thing is, and this is the big contrast to Japan. I mean there's all the people like the most frequent question I get at the moment is like what can we learn from Japan, right? And I say, well, let's focus on what's different, because when Japan had its crisis, its bankrupt banks, right? The rest of the world was on fire. The rest of the world throughout the 1990s, for a variety of reasons, had the highest growth rates in 3 generations, right? So that was a tremendous cushion that Japan had. Right now, and this is where America comes in, you speak to Tim Geithner, and he said, well, yeah, they should be doing more, but hey, I'm sorry, I've got my hand full too with my own domestic issues, because I just got downgraded, and I got a bunch of politicians running around Washington who can't even decide what to have for breakfast, right? I mean, sorry. So it's in this respect, I think that, if I, and I turned 50 this year, so I can pretend to be wise. But I think that one of the things that will come out of this, because we don't just have a crisis in Europe, right? I think we've got a genuine crisis of capitalism, a real crisis of capitalism. And, you've got, the Americans, right, advocating a more, a change in the tax system, right? You've got the Americans, I work for JP Morgan, right? Well, we're not allowed to increase our dividend. Excuse me? This is America. You're not allowed to increase the dividend because the Treasury doesn't let you, because you're supposed to hire more people? Wow, very interesting that this would happen. So you've got a genuine crisis here, but the point is, who's going to work? What does this mark? This marks the real emergence of the People's Republic of China, right? And you're already seeing strong leadership from the Chinese. China is the world's largest creditor country, right? Followed by Japan, but China is the largest creditor country. And already China is not just writing a check. China is saying, why should we buy these bonds? No, the terms, no, we don't agree with the terms. We're not clear about that. So I think that, also what you've seen over the last 2 weeks, which I think is the most important thing, because, the cock-up in Washington, the cock-up in Brussels, basically is business as usual, right? But what has happened over the last 2 weeks? China has begun to ease both its money and its fiscal policy, because they're beginning to see a slowdown in inflation. And for the Japanese business community, that's very, very important. How quickly, how focused can you be to actually rely on a global economy that runs on one engine, which is Asia, which is China? Don't count on America, don't count on Europe, because they will have problems. You are now focused on China.
Does anybody else agree that it's basically what's happening is really a challenge, or there's a question of whether the capitalism is the right system or not? Because what reminded me of when I was listening to Jesper is when the Lehman crisis hit, I saw a lot of debates happening in Japan that whether the capitalism should be replaced by a new system or a new social system or not. But I really didn't see that kind of debate in Europe, in the US, and not even in China. They're actually following the economic theory, which is based on the capitalism. So when I always feel a bit, awkward that when the people started challenging the capitalism itself. So if you use it anecdotally, that's fine, but
I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. First, I do think we're having a crisis of capitalism. I think we're also having a crisis of global governance because we are still operating with a global governance system in terms of the international financial system that was built in 1945 and has had precious little reform. I mean, to put it in very stark terms, why should Europe be treated any differently by the IMF than Indonesia in 1997? The problems are the same. So it should be dealt with. But it's not, because we still have not yet reflected the shifts that have taken place in the global economy over the last 10 to 15 years. So I think that's the crisis that we have. But I think what's reflected, and comes back to Berlin, where I have been recently, and I can attest, yes, there are those cars that are being burned every night. And I think it's also, and you see it in the United States with the Occupy Wall Street movement. I think that there is a big issue of inequality. There's an issue of how the rewards have been distributed. There's an issue of how those who have been in charge of the system have benefited from the system. You have legitimate analysts and critics talking about crony capitalism in the United States. Now, I think some of that discussion can go too far, but there's no doubt that a system which does not provide an appropriate set of reward and opportunity for those to rise up in the system, both economically and socially, I think is going to ultimately have some trouble. And then I come back to Japan, because having lived here for 18 years, now I spend a lot more time in Europe and the US, I have to say, I step back and I think about the following. So America, we have one lost decade. 10 years of low growth, high unemployment, rising unemployment. Europe, we have a lost decade, like Japan has had. Will it be as calm, peaceful, orderly as Japan is, I have serious doubt. And I think that that's an issue that needs to be reflected upon. We spend too often too much time, bemoaning our fate in Japan of low growth and deflation and the many issues we face, but we don't spend enough time looking at the very important strengths in society. And these are very substantial strengths. And so when you think about, in economic terms, some of the strain that we have faced in this country, and then you try to reflect that onto the United States, onto Europe, I think that there are some very serious issues that they face, and that will be the crisis of capitalism that they will have to face.
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly, it's interesting. We at JP Morgan in Europe, we don't know whom to call. We don't know whom to call anymore. Who will take responsibility? Now, in Japan, we had fun, political kabuki. It's always good fun, right? But you always know whom to call. I mean, the BOJ is the BOJ. The Ministry of Finance is the Ministry of Finance, and the Cabinet Office is the Cabinet Office, right? In Europe, very, very tricky, right? America, and this is, just to be hopeful on 2 points here, right? I think that right now, yes, Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and all these people have their problems, right? But for all intents and purposes, there is going to be an election in America next year. We'll see, we can prognosticate, but right now, I mean, it's, a year away, we don't really know. Chances are, or I certainly personally have enough faith in America, right, to emerge very strong, right, out of this election, that the system of checks and balances and writing there works very, very well, right? Japan itself, has been dealing with the issues, right? Japan, I mean, it's interesting because, if you compare it with Germany, actually, over the last 15 years, nominal GDP, nominal incomes have stagnated, right? But real GDP is actually up, by on average about 1.5%, which is actually the same that Germany has been doing, right? And then more importantly, look at the future. Japanese companies, the banks were bad, the politics were bad, there wasn't a solution, Ben Bernanke was lecturing them, nothing was happening, but corporate Japan continued to invest very aggressively in research and development, patents, innovation. Still my new favorite statistics here in Japan, not the one from Germany, is that, that Apple iPhone, the first Apple iPhone, how many components were made by Japanese companies? Almost zero for the first. That was a big shock for the electronics industry, right? The new Apple iPhone, the 4S Super G, something that my daughter absolutely wants, that thing, the new Apple iPhone, we reckon that about 57% of all the components are made by Japanese companies and can only be made by Japanese companies because of the degree of precision, right, that is involved there. So, it remains to be seen, right, whether European companies in particular will continue, right, with their focus on innovation in the way that the Japanese actually have done so spectacularly over the last generation.
I think the Jesper's recommendation is a buy for Japanese stock, but sounds like at the moment. So the Keiichiro, you want to add something, or just you can?
Well, as far as I don't want to use the word failure of capitalism, but I think what is common, what's happening in common in developed economies is that we're losing, to an extent, middle class. And a friend of mine has recently made a very interesting observation as to why Warren Buffett in the United States, who's the largest owner, I guess, of Coca-Cola, is advocating to tax on the richest people. His point is that the richest people can't drink Coca-Cola, 100 Coca-Colas a day. You have to have 100 people that can drink Coca-Cola. And that's why you need to raise your middle class. And the reason why we are losing middle class in developed economies is that the infrastructure or the manufacturing plants are shifting outside of your own domain. In Japan, we're shifting to China, US globally, Europe, I guess Germans have shifted towards Eastern Europe, French maybe to Southern Europe, but and you're losing your own from your own domain, your country. And so how should we deal with this? I mean, that you can't say your companies to move out. You can't stop them. I mean, as a Japanese politician, I can't say to Murata Seisakusho to stay in Japan. They want to build their components in China to be used in Apple 4S, as Esper has mentioned. So I think the solution is to what could you keep within your own domain, and at the same time, how should you employ those who are who lost their jobs? I mean, the only industry that could employ is the service industry. I mean, the service is consumed in in your own city. I mean, you need to have certain service industry, and I guess the difficult challenge is how do you allow service industry to pay for a certain amount of salary that is, equal to middle-class people? There's no answer to that. I mean, probably if you allow service industry to have certain amount of monopoly or whatever rent from your service, then you can do that. To an extent, we have done that in Japan. That therefore we have been paying a very high amount of price on electricity. Electricity is a service industry. The people working in the electricity industry has been enjoying high amount of salary. However, it was because of the earthquake incident in Fukushima that might be a little bit difficult. But I think the answer is both the taxation and service industry with, to an extent, with a certain amount of monopolized profit to subsidize the amount of salary being paid equivalent to the middle class. And that, I think, is the fundamental question of, is that capitalism or something not? So, but, you are acting in global economy, so you have to say you are capitalist, but in a sense, to finance the employment, you would have to modify to a certain extent of your capitalism.
Just to give enough time to the floor for questions, I just want to move on to the third topic, which is whether Japan should be involved and how, if they want to be involved, to solve this Eurozone crisis. And the Japanese government just did the foreign currency intervention recently, and Mr. Azumi is really working hard at the moment trying to get the sort of support from G20 countries. At the same time, Japan seems to have already agreed, according to the press, to buy more of a European Fiscal Stability Facility bond, although they are already the biggest bondholder of the fund outside of Eurozone, owning about 20% at the moment. And I wonder, if I were in charge of a negotiation of the currency policy, why don't we just use it as the negotiation card? We buy your European Financial Stability Fund bonds, but don't make any complaint about foreign currency intervention because you're not in a position to stop us buying euro. But I always find it's kind of frustrating. Japan just to continue to give, sort of to help the Europe or US when the crisis happens, but we're not getting anything really in return. So what do you think is the Keiichiro? How we should be?
Well, first of all, we have to understand the fact that probably for Japanese industry, German companies are one of the biggest competitors. And the German companies are benefiting from weaker euro, and to an extent. And they have been benefiting. And I think the Japanese companies are competing against the German companies and Korean companies in the Chinese market. So we have to realize that the weaker euro is, it's not good for at least our industry and hence our economy. So what should we do? We should help the euro to be stronger. And also at the same time, how should we deal with that? One way is to have more Bank of Japan easing of they should basically issue more Japanese notes. Hopefully the ECB won't do that, but that's one way. And I don't know why, but BOJ is quite hesitant to issue more of their notes. So the other solution is to intervene. So and then if we are to intervene, maybe we could say that, hey, we should you shouldn't say anything about that to the European counterparts. The other way is that I think the only, Terry has mentioned 4 scenarios, but I think the ultimate scenario is to have at least political unification to the fiscal policy. So we should put a condition on purchasing the bonds that the 17 countries have to come out with a scenario to unify their fiscal policy, and that's I think the only way to bail out the euro, and also to have all of our investment out. I won't say this in my own district because I do believe that the crisis of euro is affecting our own economy. But a Japanese politician can say that, could argue in a sense that if we are not financing the recovery from the earthquake in the northern parts of Japan, or if we are taxing for that, why should we just, the way we are buying euro bonds is we are issuing our own bonds. In a sense, so we're borrowing from our own people and financing the Europeans. So if we are borrowing from our own people, why don't we just finance our own people in Fukushima and Miyagi and Iwate? So we could also argue that, at least, and then at least in negotiation with the European counterparts, we should say that. And so it is very difficult, in a sense that it is very difficult for Japanese to, finance the earthquake. So it will be more difficult to finance the European crisis, and therefore we will demand your unification of political, system. So
you still believe the economic impact of this eurozone potential crisis, the collapse will be bigger than the tsunami and earthquake.
Oh,
so
of course. I mean, for instance, just imagine the euro to be, devalued to even to 70 yen per euro. Then Mercedes-Benz will sell much more in China than Toyota Lexus.
Thierry, I think you told me that you think it's a crazy idea for Japanese to finance crazy European.
So here's, I would shift the discussion to the international financial institutions. And, my view is that in many of these international fora, Japan is always behaving as the best student in the class. They come to class on time, they have a very neat uniform, they take notes, they listen to the teacher says, now it's time to go, they go, the teacher says, sit down, they sit down. I think it's time to stop this. I think it's time to stop this. I think because I think that the European situation is so grave and so serious that they should no longer be allowed to have the power that they have within the system. I think Japan, as the leading creditor nation with China, need to work together here to redefine the international financial architecture. I'd like to see that in a cooperative way, and Japan is very cooperative. There is no more supportive country. When you sit in Europe and you listen to the press and all the rest, Japan gets very good press as a supportive country. And so there's no issue there. China is a little bit more mitigated. The US, recently some misstep. I think that Tim Geithner perhaps didn't handle well going to Poland for the summit, and he certainly wasn't treated very well. So hopefully we can get everyone around the table to do this in a systematic and intelligent and collegial way. But I also think the time has come for Japan and China to put some markers down in terms of requirements. Now, Jesper, I think, has some even bolder ideas on this topic.
I mean, look, I think if you want to be, let's have a glass of good wine and, wow, we could end up with a central world bank, that you actually have, what you should have. You should do away with all these national currencies and just have one central bank and, that being managed properly, right? Maybe we could get there. Now, it would take a heroic, absolutely phenomenal effort, right, for that to actually come through. So I think it's impractical. So I would agree that, Japan, number one, should be more assertive, right, and should be more proactive. But, the biggest defense is to be strong at home. There are lots of issues that all of us here, and, you, Sensei, as a member of the decision-making process, you are probably the most frustrated of all. But all of us are very frustrated that there are decisions that need to be made in Japan that somehow cannot be made, that somehow get postponed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the best defense for Japan is to move forward, to attack its own problems, make decisions, right? And be more of what Terry alluded to at the beginning, which is that, yeah, Japan is looking good. Now, if you just look good because everybody else starts to look bad, that's no good. You want to start to look good by yourself, right? And again, the Germans, Angela Merkel went to the election polls and says, you vote for me because I want to raise the German consumption tax. And the voter says, hi, okay. That is the sort of leadership that one needs, because it's quite obvious, right, that you do need a better tax base.
I just want to touch on what the actually theory you just mentioned. I mean, it's just Japan. This is a time to become not the teacher's boy or teacher's student. But I think there's always a fear among Japanese that when we do something good and try to use it as a part of negotiation, we will just lose our image of good, supporter, as you mentioned. And I personally, don't think that's the case. But it's probably better to hear from you rather than from my.
Yeah, I certainly can witness that concern, but I think it's a false concern. And by the way, I think that the Chinese are going to be mighty tough when the time comes. So get into that slipstream and get over those concerns would be my view. And by the way, again, in all world fora, Japan has earned its position. There is absolutely no doubt about that. So there should be no concern that, oh my goodness, something else, or fear something bad will happen to us. That is certainly not going to be the case, given the track record that Japan has.
It's great to hear that. And I think before we move on to the Q&A, Jesper, Keiichiro, you want to add the last comment? Or
I just would say, that there's all these problems. I do think it's a genuine crisis of capitalism, and this marks the emergence of the People's Republic of China. And to bring it down to the point that Sensei made, middle class, the Chinese Communist Party is dead focused on making sure that the Chinese middle class grows, right? All of our companies, whether it is fast retailing, or whether it is Toyota, or whether it is Volkswagen, or whether it is, I was going to say Olympus, but sorry. Everybody, this is the market. This is the middle class, right? And I just want to tell you an anecdote. Many of you are students here. I'm going next week to that Boston Career Forum, right? Which, as you know, is where, those companies like JP Morgan who are committed to Japan, and many Japanese companies are doing their recruiting. Of my applications this year, 40% are Chinese kids. And of those 40%, about half speak absolutely fluent Japanese, right? So little hint here, the emergence that we've talked about is very real, and also for Japan, right? This is going to pose some very, very interesting challenges and opportunities going forward.
Yeah, well, again, I think this crisis in Europe is our crisis to an extent, and I think we have many problems with domestically, but at the same time, we should deal with the crisis in Europe in a manner that will help our own country as well. And for one way is that if the euro is valued very cheap vis-a-vis yen, then the Japanese corporations could decide on buying European companies if and only if their global market share becomes bigger. In other words, if they could capture global market share of 50%, then they should go for it.
Thank you very much. Actually, our fund managed to sell Nycomed to Takeda, so it's really, we appreciate strong IN. So this is time for question from the floor. So if anybody want to have a question, maybe start with.
Well, thank you very much for interesting discussion. I'm Jiro Kokuria from Keio University. I'm an amateur in fiscal policy or finance, so but please educate me. Still, I really don't understand what the problem is. Are we talking about a few countries losing fiscal discipline? Are we talking about maldesign of the euro system? Or are we talking about systematic failure of democracy? Or are we talking about excess money seeking for fictitious returns? I mean, what's the problem?
Okay, you are buying me dinner, and we're going to drink a lot. Because the nice thing about the Bismarck, I think, says making of fiscal policy is like making sausages. It's a bloody and messy process. What happened in Greece is very simple. Governments borrow, right? Unlike Japan, because Greece is a debtor country, right? About 75% of the bonds, of the IOUs, are owned by non-Greek investors, right? And so what happened is that they kept on getting more and more in debt, right? The economy started to slow down, so their ability to service that debt was being put into question, right? And when some of these bonds had to be refinanced, the global investors demanded a higher interest rate, for that. And that basically spiraled out of bounds to actually cripple the inability of the government to actually repay the debt, right? That's really what happened. The crux of the problem is, if you look at a country like Argentina or like Turkey or like Venezuela, which had fiscal crises, before, you have a flexible currency. So even though Argentina also had about 80% of its creditors, of its bankers, right, were outside of Argentina, when Argentina's ability to service the debt came into question, the currency depreciated very dramatically. That cannot happen because Greece is part of the euro and those nasty Germans won't let them to devalue their currency, right? So that's sort of the crux of the matter of what actually happened. Right? So the economics is actually basically in the first 50 pages of a macroeconomic textbook, right? It's not complicated.
So that's the fundamental part of the problem. One thing as a footnote is that it's not as if it's only the Greeks and the Italians and the Spaniards who, were borrowing too much money. The first two countries to violate the agreement, the pact, with regard to fiscal policy were France and Germany. Okay? The problem, and there's an excellent article by my economics tutor, Larry Summers, in today's FT. The problem is that you don't get out of this problem with confiscatory fiscal policy. You have to have growth. Unfortunately, and this is a little bit of, the challenge with Germans, some inflation, but with slow growth and deflation, you have a serious problem. And then you'll say, well, what about Japan? Well, again, back to another point that Jesper made, Japan's strength is that obviously we control currency, fiscal policy, it's all here, and also all the debt is owned here by Japanese, or just about all of it, whereas much of this debt in Europe got outside of the system.
Looking for, I thought you were asking whether the problem is about the currency system or democracy in Europe or EU itself or the crisis of capitalism. How fundamentally serious the situation is.
That's basically the question.
I thought that's what
maybe one dinner may not be.
But it starts with the money. When the money stops, there's a crisis. That's why people hate bankers, right?
in capitalism. Keiichiro, you want to add something?
The answer is that the global economy, whether you like it or not, the economy itself is globalized. So to answer your question, it's a combination of everything.
Okay, I like your tie.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, yes. Yes, sorry, my name's Nicholas Adams. I'm a student here at Globis. My question is, progressing slightly beyond this, over at least the last 20, 30 years, if you read a lot of, for example, science fiction writing, many books dated as early as 2020 or so, they see global financial collapses in America, in Europe, in Asia. Could be any of these countries, a number of books. And you see mega global corporations come in and take over from government and run the countries. Do you actually foresee something like this Greek crisis spiraling out of control like this and actually being the stepping stone to let corporations take over from government?
Maybe start from the other person in the parliament. Yeah.
Well, I don't think corporations could take over the government, to answer your question, because by definition, governments cannot tax, corporations cannot tax governments. It's vice versa. Governments can tax corporations and people. Corporations could run away from your country, and it's easier to run away from your country than before. So that's happening, and I think that is the cause, at least part of the cause of this crisis. And again, to counter companies running away from your own country, that may be the cause to create Eurozone. And, I mean, if you have a single currency, it is the same for a Greek company to stay in Greek or to go to Germany. But because of the fact that they didn't allow you to tax, they didn't allow the German government to tax the Greek companies, it's not efficient. And therefore, I believe that the final solution is to have the same tax authority, at least within the Eurozone.
I would say briefly, you know, what we are going through now is much more strange and serious than fiction. I'll give you an anecdote. You know, in the middle of the last summit discussion, so it's a Saturday evening, the 23rd of October, and heated discussion. What are we going to do? We have to come up with a package. It must be done this weekend. And the Belgian Prime Minister gets up and says, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I have to go." Sarkozy turns to him and says, "You mean you have something more important to do than to be here to solve this problem?" He said, "Yes, I am going to the film premiere of Tintin. You can't make this up."
And I'm getting a lot of dinners here. This is great. In financial markets, right? This is already happening because Toyota is more creditworthy than the Japanese government. Right now, the services that the government provides, you know, the organized or legalized theft with taxation, right? That's a different issue, but very interesting.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, so maybe this could be the time for the last question.
You should nominate her to be the tax collector in Greece.
Yeah, I'm very disciplined. Yes, definitely. Thanks.
Okay, top one. Who has been raising hand from the beginning? You? Yeah.
Well, I would just like to ask what you think about, in the aftermath, after Fukushima, then TEPCO was sort of being accused of not sort of being able to foresee this 11-meter wave. So isn't there a parallel in the creation of the euro back in the 90s? Isn't there a flaw in the actual creation of euro? Didn't the creators foresee these problems enough? We haven't really talked about the creation.
Is that original?
We're all blaming Helmut Schmidt. Look, I mean, you know, I think that obviously, look, there's a big flaw, right? There have been critics. You know, it's not as though this wasn't unknown, right? But like what happens in many of these aspirational issues, your policy becomes what I call toriaizu, right? I mean, let's go from here to there, let's go from there to here. And in Germany, there still are, and I think, you got to give a little hope where a little hope is due, right? There still are people, well, if we do get fiscal union, if we do get a truly unified Europe, right, as a result of that, then that's ultimately the historic outcome, right, that everybody was looking for. It's just that right now, that just seems very, very far, because people are getting poorer, people are disorganized, and people are focused on going to the premiere of Tintin. Very good movie, by the way.
There are technocrats in Brussels who, in all due seriousness, say, yes, we're having a problem here. It's just the result of a design flaw. And my response to that is this the kind of design flaw that, if it's a bridge and I'm walking over the bridge and the design flaw kicks in, I fall in the river and I'm dead? That kind of design flaw? I think that, so it's not that these people were stupid or dishonest. I think one thing is that there was a very important aspirational aspect to this project. It came about, in my view, the history may still remain to be written, but I think that this phase of the European construction, which had started with, yes, the European coal and steel community in Luxembourg, was when Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl decided we must advance. I think that a big part of it was Mitterrand seeing the unification of Germany and saying, oh my goodness, we better do something here before things, get perhaps out of the control of a European construction. But Kohl saw that immediately, and hand in hand, they did this. Then I think a series of intelligent and well-meaning people put together this with the view, we'll advance. Yes, it's not perfect. We'll go to the next stage. And I think, unfortunately, what then happened is that we, did not actually go and actually work through the next stage, piece by piece.
Hold on. Let the Keiichiro say something before you say this thing.
Well, I guess in case of Euro, you haven't had people evacuate from the power plant yet. So if you have, actual hit, then this discussion of whether you have foreseen it or not, it will happen.
I personally want to give a lot of credit to Germany and France, because if you look at what the Margaret Thatcher said at the time of they decided not to join the euro, she correctly pointed out all those design failures, but that happened, and it may sustain. I don't know at the moment, but I really want to give a credit to the politician at that time who took a real leadership to make it happen, because it's a big job. But if you're interested, now the Thatcher is regaining respect, because what's happening in what's being pointed out now as a design failure has been correctly pointed out by her at the time of their debate. I think we are unfortunately running out of time, and I'm sure that the Jesper and the Thierry and the Keiichiro will be happy to answer your question. It hasn't been addressed so far. And thanks again for the panelists for that enlightening debate and quite thought-provoking debate for myself as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for exciting discussion.